Our next presenter is Leonard Diepeveen from the Department of English at Dalhousie University. Leonard's work has transformed scholarly understanding of how the modernist canon came to be, particularly how it was shaped by skeptical reactions to modernist claims for cultural prominence. Working with an unexplored archive of daily and weekly journalism, Diepeveen's research examines the rise of difficulty as an aesthetic value, place of parody, scandal, fraud, and intent in aesthetic experience.
There is a new kind of literature abroad in the land, whose only obvious fault is that no one can understand it. So wrote Time magazine on the occasion of the publication of James Joyce's Ulysses and T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land. My work centers on the function of the scandals and derision that greeted the arrival of modernist art in the first decades of the 20th century, with responses such as, "Someone has applied an egg beater to my brain," to "A grunt would serve equally well," to "This book appears to have been written by a perverted lunatic who's made a specialty of the literature of the latrine." It wasn't just negative reviews, though. Included such things as faux fashion shows and design, parodies and cartoons, hoaxes, and even mock trials. Here, of poor Henri Matisse. There's an oddness to this response. Skeptics did not assert that modernism was simply poor quality art, but that modernists, in their violation of canonical norms, were frauds, insincere. There's a bizarre correlation. The more ridicule an author or artist received, the more central they would become to the new canon. Yet given this response, in under a decade a very stable canon had formed, a canon radically different from the established set of works that had preceded it. Even a skeptic such as Max Eastman argued in 1931 that there had been a veritable international conquest of power by the cult of unintelligibility. The consensus held in place until the mid-70s, with names like Joyce, Woolf, Eliot, Picasso, Matisse, Stravinsky, and is a starting point of my research, which has been about the people who made this skeptical initial response, this response's place in intellectual history, its relationship to modern canon, and how modernism's proponents respond to it. Now, my discipline's instincts have been to ignore this response. After all, not only are these responses on the wrong side of history, but more crucially, they are terrible as arguments, one-liners in ephemeral publication, responses that are dismissive and don't take the work seriously. They don't invite significant analysis. On the other hand, these responses form a huge archive and had some then important people weighing in. So, what would it look like to take these responses seriously? What would serious mean in this context? The first step is not to assess their value as logical argument, but to take them seriously by trying to understand the work they did. In their brevity and dismissiveness, they don't really argue, they assert. More performative than logical, they take modernism out of an aesthetic sphere and into some other sphere of human activity, such as hoaxes or fashion or P.T. Barnum sideshows. They place it not in the sphere of art, but of moral evaluation. Performativity is a tricky thing to pull off, but these responses show all the signs and confidence of belonging to a community of shared knowledge and agreement. In that context, these responses' lack of evidence isn't so much a sign of weakness as a belief in and demonstration of shared values. The values nestled in the jokes of daily columnists implied a consenting readership, as did their deictic markers and the readers who enthusiastically wrote in with their own parodies. In their elisions, these sources reveal the things they thought did not need to be argued for, but that could be simply stated. This is ideology in action. These values are the day's default aesthetic, those beliefs you could reach to without arguing for, those things that could be simply stated rather than explicated. My research has revealed that default aesthetic to be a kind of domesticated romanticism, a belief that art doesn't develop, that it should be simple, that it's commonsensical, and isn't excessive. Art in this default aesthetic is mimetic a form of emotional expression. Further, real art must evince culturally understood signs of sincere intent, and clear communication of that intent is central to art. Under this default aesthetic, modernism isn't so much bad as it is a fraud or a hoax. It couldn't be taken seriously. Stepping outside of default values to do something new always raises these questions of sincere intent. The modernist canon was formed in an interaction with these negative assessments and the ways in which they were asserted. To accommodate modernism, art became understood less as emotional expression and more as knowledge, as an advance and as a response to the times. To counteract the accusations of fraud and insincerity, modernism saw the rise of close reading and interpretation, of evidence-based argumentation, forms of reading that asserted that difficult works are necessary in the 20th century. And finally, there was an assertion of the usefulness in art of unclear intents and the centrality of irony. Some changes came at a cost, though. Following from the skeptical sense that modernism was a fraud was an assertion that intent is irrelevant to aesthetic experience, a stricture that also applied to the place of emotion and affect in interpretation. And all of this, as with any aesthetic system, shrunk the diversity of art. With my research, I've developed an account of how difficult art became our most prestigious and important art, shown why intent disappeared from our aesthetic categories, articulated the ways in which seriousness has changed its definition and function in aesthetic experience, described how public discourse, such as scandals, function as performative rituals, and I've postulated a theory of intent as unknowable yet central to aesthetic experience.